Good morning. So not to get super real with you right away, but it's about 11 years ago that I went through a little bit of a traumatic experience. I had to watch the second half of the final installment of the Twilight series. You see, I love my wife dearly, but I hated that movie. It was so bad. It was really bad, especially the second half. Now, if you're not familiar with the Twilight series, I want to just give you a really unsatisfying overview of it really quick. And if you love the movies, it's okay. We have people ready to pray for you afterwards, but no, you can like it. But just here, do me a favor. I'm commenting today on the movie, not on the book, okay? So one, they may be different. I don't know. I haven't read the book. Number two, I have zero intentions of reading the book. So if you come up and say, oh, you should give the book a chance, that's not happening, okay? So all of that is preface. The movie was so bad. Now, in fairness to the entire series, the whole thing was bad. And so, but Janine and I had invested, once a year, a couple hours a year into watching this series, and she had read the books, she really liked them, so I was like, okay, I'm gonna go along and finish this out. I'm no quitter. And so we go in and we watch it, and I'm watching the last segment of this movie unfold, and I'm thinking to myself, I'm actually enjoying this. Confession. I'm actually enjoying this because what happens in the last one is there's actually a battle that happens. And now, violence, no, is not necessarily a good thing, but there was sacrifice in the story. And for the first time in the entire series, I'm watching people give up their lives on behalf of one another, and it's sucking me in, and I'm thinking, finally, a story worth telling. After all this time, I'm finally captivated by the story. And then we get to the end of the movie, and everything kind of zooms out from the end of the battle scene with all of the carnage that battle had in it. And just so you're aware, the battle was really between, are you ready for this? Good vampires and bad vampires. But don't worry, because the thing that carried it on was a love triangle between a human girl, a vampire, who's good, and then kind of a sort of a werewolf, but not really, okay? More of like a big dog. I know, don't rush out of here and go rent it right away, but so at the end of this battle scene, the bad vampires there's carnage on the bad vampire side, on everybody else's side with these almost sort of werewolves, and the good vampires, and they're all on this side, and just there's this carnage, and you're thinking, oh my goodness, this cost so much. And it's at that point where the fullness of the story is settling in on you, and they zoom back out, and you realize the whole thing was just a vision of what would have happened if they had gone to war. And I was like, oh no, I hate this again. You see, they wanted the peace and all of that came out of the battle, but they didn't actually want to sacrifice for it. And it hit me that there's a reason that I liked it when they were willing to sacrifice, and I hated it when they weren't willing to sacrifice. I think there's something in us that draws us towards stories where it costs somebody something. We are not drawn into stories, nor do we think they are especially inspiring when a story doesn't cost us anything. I mean, an uninspiring story with no sacrifice to it is the same as me telling you about our trip to the grocery store where, guess what? Spoiler alert, we came out with the groceries. Well, what happened while you went to get groceries? Oh, nothing. We just went up and down the aisles. This one time I thought we got separated, but it turns out we didn't. Just didn't recognize each other with masks on. Right? It's that kind of story that is uninspiring. We are drawn towards stories where it costs somebody something. We need this kind of understanding of self-sacrifice in order for a story to be inspiring. I think it's one reason we are drawn to the story of the person of Jesus, the person who did not deserve anything, yet took everything on himself for our sake, that we might be raised to new life with him. The one person who didn't deserve to be punished was brutally murdered, and he gave of it himself, his own life, on behalf of others. It cost him something. It is an inspiring story. If you look at all of the stories that inspire us, the stories that we are drawn into, there was a cost, there was a sacrifice. Now, one of the issues, though, is that in our own lives, oftentimes, we want that kind of victorious ending to our story, but it hopefully doesn't cost us a single thing. It hopefully doesn't actually require any sacrifice or self-giving of me. We just want that kind of ending. Pastor Mark Sayers says it this way: we want the kingdom without the king. We want all the benefits of being in relationship with God. We want all the benefits of life, but we don't want to allow Jesus to be the one in control. Because if we let Jesus be in control, we have to realize that we can't enthrone Jesus while we are still on the throne. And in order for us to step down off the throne of our own lives, that requires a bit of something called self-denial. And it's hard. It's hard because in order to deny ourselves, we have to look at ourselves in a different light. You see, we live in a day and age where understanding ourselves really means about doing this kind of deep dive to realize who I am in full honesty. And then once I do that, I'm there and I'm good. The gospel of Jesus, though, tells us something else. The gospel of Jesus says that once you realize who you are, then you can actually accept Jesus in place of all the brokenness that's inside. And that means taking all that we are, placing it before Jesus with kind of these open hands and saying, this is yours. All of my identity, all of everything that I thought I was, all that I had hoped to be, it's yours. You can have it, you can be in charge, you can rule and reign over my life. And that's completely counter to the kind of the narrative, the story that we're being given, which is true understanding of ourselves. True identity is by truly understanding ourselves, not truly understanding the person of Jesus. That's an entirely different narrative, and one that the good news of Jesus directly tackles. And it's going to be a challenge for us when we're about to dive in. It's going to be a challenge for us because it's going to confront everything we thought was an identity. You see, more and more the world is working, and I include us in the world, more and more the world is working toward understanding who we are in terms of political identity. We understand ourselves in terms of social identity. We understand ourselves in terms of professional identity. But the gospel, at its heart, is the story about the person of Jesus, and at the center of that story is a cross. The self-sacrifice and self-giving love of Jesus, and the call of the gospel on our lives, the call of the story of Jesus to all of those who would follow him, with the cross at the center, is come and die. It's the only way to have the kingdom with Jesus as king. Until we do that, we're going to continue on looking very similar to what author Ben Sixsmith describes here. Ben Sixsmith, in an article that he's confronting the fall of Christian celebrities. So we've had a lot of that lately, Christian celebrities failing morally, and it's like they've built themselves up and they've created this entire set of identities in the world, and they've actually patterned themselves after the world more than after Jesus, and then eventually the outworking of that life just happens, and unfortunately, we see it. And really unfortunately, sometimes we celebrate it. This is what Ben Sixsmith says. I am not religious, so it is not my place to dictate to Christians what they should and should not believe. Still, if someone has a faith worth following, I feel that their beliefs should make me feel uncomfortable for not doing so. right? So he said, I love that line. I feel that their beliefs should make me feel uncomfortable for not doing so. If they share 90% of my lifestyle and values, then there is nothing especially inspiring about them. Instead of making me want to become more like them, it looks very much as if they want to become more like me. Now, this perfectly captures the story that I felt like I grew up in the early 90s. And I remember so many times in youth group or in youth conferences that we would go to or in devotionals that were geared toward my age group, there was this whole movement in the church where it was pushing back against culture that said the church is rule-bound, the church is obsolete, the church is boring, and it's outdated. And the church was pushing back and saying, no, we are cool. We are cool. And I grew up in a generation that wanted the church to be cool, and it was pushing back against criticisms against the church. Unfortunately for us, we defined cool the way the world defines cool. And so the church started to try to be cool. And the result is 90% of our lives looks exactly the same as the rest of the world. And we just try to sprinkle a little Jesus on top. I think Ben Sixsmith nails it directly on the head. I heard this quote earlier this week, thanks to Carol pointing me to a podcast, and it just blew my mind. I had to read the entire article. It was so good. And it's challenging to us, and it challenges us to go and find the answers. So I want to invite you to turn to Matthew. We're going to be Matthew chapter 16. If you don't have a Bible, that's fine. It'll be on the screens for you. We're going to pick up in verse 24, Matthew 16:24. It says this, Then Jesus said to his disciples, "Whoever wants to be my disciple must deny themselves and take up their cross and follow me. For whoever wants to save their life will lose it, but whoever loses their life for me will find it. What good will it be for someone to gain the whole world, yet forfeit their soul? Or what can anyone give in exchange for their soul?" Now, to understand this passage, I want to just kind of give you the overview of what came before it. So Jesus is dealing with the religious elite and how they defined obedience to God and how Jesus didn't fit into that mold. And then Jesus goes one step further with his inner circle of followers, and he starts to tell them about how he won't fit into their mold. And he won't do that because he has to go and die. He talks about himself being lifted up. He's got to be killed. Now, he doesn't define what that looks like for them, simply that it must happen. And then it's at that point that one of Jesus's most bold followers, Peter, speaks up and he says, "That's never going to happen, not going to let it happen." And Jesus has to rebuke Peter and he says, "Get behind me, Satan. You don't know what mindset you're working with. You don't have your mind set on the things of God. You have your mind set merely on human concerns." I love that. We're going to pick that up in a second. Peter, you have your mind merely on human concerns. In fact, and this is where he goes into it, "Whoever wants to be my disciple must deny themselves and take up their cross and follow me." Now, something else that's interesting about the writing of this is that when Matthew wrote this letter, when he recorded the gospel, it was, scholars believe, somewhere around 80 to 90 AD. Okay, so approximately 60 years after the death of Jesus, this is written. And at that same time in history, persecution of followers of the way of Jesus is on the rise. In fact, it has never been more intense. The very real threat of death is in the face of everyone who follows Jesus. It is a dangerous and risky time to be following Jesus. So there's a number of things that is happening here, and we have to understand that all in light as we read this, because what Jesus is about to tell us is not just a metaphor. It is a very real reality. In fact, those reading this not only would understand that they are in the midst of intense persecution, where it has become commonplace just to execute Christians and followers of the way, but also that they're doing so because the leader of this movement, Jesus himself, was put to death, and he was put to death on a cross. And so we don't just read this in light of what's happening in the immediate context with Jesus and his disciples, but for those who are reading about this in retrospect, and all of the pieces are starting to come together for them. They're starting to see that maybe there's a bigger thing, that while death and rejection from society is on the line, we can take heart because there is good news in the person of Jesus. That one has gone before us who has shown us the prototype of living to be human. That is found in the person of Jesus. And so with that understanding, Matthew relays these words from Jesus: "Whoever wants to be my disciple must deny themselves and take up their cross and follow me." Now, those who were condemned to death on the cross, which was not overly common in Rome, but was common enough that people clearly understood what it meant, was that somebody who was condemned to death on a cross meant that they were raised up on a crossbeam, and not all the time were nails used like we understand in the story of Jesus, but oftentimes they were actually just tied up there, and because their body structurally couldn't support it, they would just suffocate. And it was long and excruciating, and it was obviously incredibly uncomfortable, which is a massive understatement, because they're hanging there, they can't breathe properly, and then eventually they die. So this picture is in the minds of the readers, it's in the minds of the hearers, but also in the mind is that the person who is condemned to die on a cross would have to carry that crossbeam on their body through an angry crowd. Now, here's why the crowd was angry. Number one, they didn't want to be associated with whoever was given the guilty punishment. They didn't want to be associated with that person because it meant that they could be guilty by association. Also, they felt like they got to be on the in crowd with the political elite, and they could just downright do whatever they wanted to the person who was walking through the crowd with their crossbeam. So the person who had to take up their cross literally had to take up the crossbeam of their cross, walk out to the place of their execution in the midst of a violent, angry, and condemning mob who was allowed to do whatever they wanted to. This is not a neat and pretty picture of what it means to follow Jesus, but unfortunately, it is the reality of those of us who want to follow Jesus. Jesus talks about denying themselves, and we have to understand this under this term, denying ourselves, in light of what Jesus had just spoken to Peter when he tells him that you don't have the mind and concerns of God, but you have merely human concerns. When we are to deny ourselves, that means denying everything that is a mere human concern. Now, for Jesus and for Matthew, as he's writing this, he most certainly on the surface means actual death. This is a real reality for you today. If you follow Jesus, you may be put to death for that. Now, that's not in our immediate future. It's not necessarily off the table, but it's not in our immediate future. But this deeper understanding of merely human concerns and denying those things is immediate concern. The fact that we can live 90% the same as the world, which is understood here as merely human concerns, means we have not done the work of denying ourselves. It means we have not taken up our cross and being willing to walk to derision through a crowd. So verse 24, whoever wants to be my disciple must deny themselves and take up their cross and follow me. Verse 25, for whoever wants to save their life will lose it, but whoever loses their life for me will find it. Jesus does something interesting here. You see, Greeks are a little bit more intricate in their language than we are, even though we're probably harder to, it's said that English is the hardest language to learn. It's very complex, but we have one word for life. We just use it a lot of different ways. Right? Like, that's really life-giving. I'm alive, right? We have those kind of different nuances to the exact same word. Greeks didn't work that way. They actually had 3 different words for life, and Jesus uses one of those words. Now, the other 2 words that Jesus doesn't use refer to maybe the way we would understand life, in terms of not dead, in terms of walking and living and breathing and all of those things that mean that we are not dead. That's not what Jesus uses. In fact, he uses a term that's a little bit different. It's the word we get our word psyche from. In Greek, it's psyche. It, at its heart, means our true self. It means the essence of who we are, the essence of who you are as a person. That's what Jesus means by life here. Whoever wants to save their sihi will lose it. But whoever loses their sihi for me will find it. Whoever is holding on to all of the things that you're concerned about, all of these different identities within the world, all of these different cares and concerns, if that's the thing you try to grasp, it is going to slip through your fingers. Have you ever tried to hold really fine sand or tried to grasp water? Watch a toddler trying to take a bath or play in a pool at some point, and you're going to understand they're trying to pick that up and it just slips right out through their hands. But what happens if you want to hold, what do you have to do if you want to hold fine sand or water? You actually have to hold it with an open hand, don't you? I think that might be kind of the thing that Jesus is alluding to here. That if we try to grasp onto the thing that makes us us, if we try to grasp onto what we understand as true and real life, if we try to grasp who we are, we end up losing it. But if we're willing to offer it up with open hands, if we're willing to let that thing go for the sake of Jesus, then we'll find it. In fact, here's the reality. In order to find our true life, we have to stop looking to ourselves for meaning. That's what Jesus means by these cares and concerns. If we are looking all around us for meaning in our life, if we're looking all around us and inside of ourselves for meaning, we are actually going to miss the actual meaning of life. It's kind of backwards, and Jesus always was backwards because Jesus was always pointing past the immediate to the eternal. Jesus was always pointing past the temporal for the foreverness in the message. And so in order to find our true life, we must stop looking to ourselves for the meaning. That's what Jesus means when he says, deny yourself, take up their cross, follow me. For whoever wants to save their true selves, whoever wants to save the essence of who they are will lose it. When they try to grasp onto the mere human concerns, we lose it. But if we are willing to lose all of those things, if we are willing to lay aside who we believe we are, for the sake of Jesus, we will find who we were truly meant to be. Jesus continues on. What good will it be for someone to gain the whole world yet forfeit their soul? This is Jesus' way of underlying the reality of this passage. That there are things that we try to do in life to keep life the way we want it to be or to give it the meaning that we want it to have. That's like trying to gain the whole world. It's trying to get everything we want and have a little bit of Jesus sprinkled on top of it. It's like saying I can have the identities that I want to have and still have Jesus, and he fits me rather than me fitting him. And in doing that, we get it backwards, but Jesus reverses it back around and really puts things in the right order. What good would it be if you can gain the whole world yet forfeit your soul? Here again, Jesus uses the word sihi. What good is it if you gain the whole world but you lose your true self? What good is it if you gain everything you ever wanted? And in this context, Jesus is saying, what good is it even if you preserve your own life at the sake of who you truly are? What good is it to hold on to mere human concerns but miss out on everything God has for you? What can anyone give in exchange for their soul, for their true self? The answer is nothing. There is nothing that anyone can give it in exchange for our true self. Now, the last note on these passages is it's entirely possible for us to look at this and to kind of bring on this stoic understanding of life where we just kind of power up and we do the best we can and we're going to live an austere life where we're just telling ourselves no to all sorts of things and we're going to try to live according to some kind of different standard. But that's not what this says. This says, deny yourself for the sake of Jesus. It's entirely possible to live differently than the world and to be hated by the world, but not for the sake of Jesus. It's entirely possible to live in the derision of our general culture, but not for the sake of Jesus. You see, if we're going to lay down our lives, if we're going to deny ourselves, it means having the concerns of God for the world around us. And the concerns of God for the world around us are always marked by love, grace, and compassion. Jesus himself said, "I have not come to judge the world, but I have come to save the world." Nothing has changed in the mission of God from the moment he spoke that until he returns for the actual judgment. Until then, we participate in the salvation of the world, not in the judgment of the world. That means sometimes for us, denying ourselves and the mere human concerns has to mean something different. It has to mean saying, I'm going to lay down my right to be right. I need to deny myself to be right so that I can be loving. I need to deny myself for the sake of Jesus so that you can experience the gospel. Friends, this should also hit us really, really practically. For my own family, we had to go through a season where we wanted to embody the gospel of Jesus to the world around us, and we weren't exactly sure what that meant, but as we were starting to understand it, we started to understand that maybe this actually affected our calendar and our social life and all of the things we do. And so we wanted to start inviting people into our life and around our table to experience the love and the grace and the compassion and mercy of Jesus. And then we realized that sounds really overwhelming. But what about my family time? But what about this other time? But what about me? We had to be willing to put that on the cross of Jesus so that we could take up the purpose of salvation, the purpose of God, the mission of God for the sake of others in the world. Denying ourselves doesn't just mean following a set of rules that we don't want to follow. Denying ourselves means taking a good hard look at where we've placed our identities, where we've placed our priorities, where we put our time, and understand that it's all garbage in comparison with the good news of Jesus. It's all nothing in comparison with the true self that we find in Jesus. Everything else is just holding on to mere human concerns. Paul goes on to echo it this way in Galatians 2:20. He says, I have been crucified with Christ, and I no longer live, but Christ lives in me. The life I now live in the body, I live by faith in the Son of God who loved me and gave himself for me. You see, that's Paul echoing in his own life the pattern of Jesus. It's no longer I who live, but Christ lives in me. This is another way of saying, if you want to follow me, you have to deny yourself, take up your cross, and follow me. Follow my pattern. Follow in my way. Do the things I've done. Be who I've been to the world around you. For some of us, that means letting go of grudges that we've held on to that are mere human concerns. Sometimes we have to let go of past offense in order to find our true selves in the person of God. At the heart of the message of Jesus is forgiveness. Paul echoes that. It's no longer I who live, but it's Christ who lives in me. You see, when people see our lives, they should see the way of the cross of Jesus marking it. They should see Jesus and his love and compassion exuding from us. When they see us, people should see Jesus. And when they do that, when we've done that, it's only then that we actually find ourselves. You see, in following Jesus, we lose nothing and we gain everything. William Barclay says it this way, as he comments on this passage: to deny oneself means, one, finally and for all, to dethrone self and to enthrone God. To deny oneself means to obliterate self as the dominant principle of life and to make God the ruling principle, more, the ruling passion of life. The life of constant self-denial is the life of constant assent to God. And once again, we realize that while we are on the throne of our own lives, while we are on the throne of defining our own identities, then Jesus cannot be on that throne. We have to step down. We have to deny that part of our mere human concerns. Life is at its best when people can see God on the throne through our lives. Jimmy Davis, the author of Cruciform, The Living Cross-Shaped Life, says it this way: we are created to look away from ourselves toward God, other people, and all of creation and say, "You first." We were created to look away from ourselves toward God, other people, and all of creation and say, "You first." In order to say "you first," we have to understand that our own meaning doesn't come from ourselves. It comes from the person of Jesus. We cannot say "you first" while we're holding on to all of the things that concern us. All of those things that we think bring true life are getting in the way of true life. It's the beauty of what Jesus not only tells us, but it's the beauty of what Jesus models for us. It's the path he led in his own life, and it's the path that he calls us toward. Again, at the heart of the gospel is a cross. It's Jesus' death. And at the heart of the call of the gospel is come and die. Let's pray.